The Galactic Academy of Higher Learning had never seen a student like this before. The halls, usually filled with whispers of knowledge and scholarly debates, were now buzzing with a different kind of discussion. Fear, curiosity, and disbelief. Today, for the first time in its long history, a Deathworlder was joining their ranks. The word itself sent a shiver through the more fragile species. Deathworlders were creatures from planets so hostile, so unforgiving, that even the strongest of the galactic elite hesitated before engaging with them. And now, one was here. Ethan Carter stepped into the Academy's main hall, his boots echoing against the polished floor. Eyes from every direction locked onto him, some wide with fascination, others narrowed with suspicion. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the aliens subtly shifted away as he walked past. He wasn't surprised. Humans were still a mystery to much of the galaxy. Stories had spread about their resilience, their adaptability, their ability to survive conditions that would kill most other species. To many, Earth was a terrifying place, a world of shifting climates, dangerous wildlife, and a gravity field that crushed weaker beings. And yet Ethan didn't look terrifying. He wasn't covered in scars, nor did he bear the monstrous features some had imagined. He was just human. A soft chime echoed through the hall as a towering reptilian figure stepped forward. Headmaster Ulzar, a member of the esteemed Dralic species, regarded Ethan with cold, calculating eyes. His voice was deep, commanding, and filled with barely concealed contempt. "Ethan Carter of Earth," he announced, ensuring the entire hall could hear, "you have been granted entry to this institution despite objections." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this. Ulzar continued, his sharp claws tapping against the datapad in his hand. "The Galactic Academy prides itself on cultivating the brightest minds in the universe. It is not a place for violence, nor for the brutish tendencies of Deathworlders. We expect you to control yourself." His yellow eyes locked onto Ethan's. "Do you understand?" Ethan met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, Headmaster. I'm here to learn, just like everyone else." The response seemed to surprise some of the students, who had likely expected something more aggressive. But the tension remained, lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. As Ethan moved toward his assigned seat, whispers followed him. "How can they let a Deathworlder in? I heard humans can lift 10 times their own weight. I bet he's dangerous. Look at him. So calm. That's the scary part." He ignored them. He had dealt with this kind of reaction before. He wasn't here to prove anything to them. At least, not yet. The first lecture began, and for a moment, it seemed like things might settle. The instructor, a pale-skinned Selvian, started explaining the history of intergalactic diplomacy. Ethan focused on the lesson, jotting down notes, trying to ignore the stares. But then, the inevitable happened. A loud thud echoed through the hall as something massive dropped onto Ethan's desk, shoving his tablet aside. A thick, clawed hand followed, gripping the surface hard enough to leave scratch marks. Ethan looked up. Standing over him was Korvac, a towering Brule warrior, one of the strongest species in the Academy. His deep red scales gleamed under the artificial lights, his yellow eyes filled with amusement. The room went silent. "You're in my seat, Deathworlder," Korvac rumbled, his voice a low growl. "Move." Ethan glanced at the empty seats around them. There were plenty of open spots. This wasn't about the seat. It was a test. A challenge. He could feel every eye on him, waiting to see what he would do. He exhaled slowly. He wasn't here to start fights, but he wasn't here to be walked over either. "Pretty sure this one was assigned to me," Ethan said casually, tapping the seat's holographic display where his name was clearly marked. "Maybe you should find another." A few hushed gasps followed his words. Korvac leaned closer, his breath hot against Ethan's face. "You think you're special, that you belong here. Deathworlders are nothing but beasts pretending to be civilized." Ethan didn't react the way the alien expected. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he smiled, a calm, confident smile that sent a flicker of uncertainty across Gorvak's face. "I guess we'll find out," Ethan said. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Gorvak's lips curled into something between a snarl and a grin. "We will." He pulled back, slamming his fist onto the desk one last time before stalking away. The tension in the hall didn't fade, but something had shifted. Ethan wasn't just a Deathworlder anymore. He was an unknown, and to many in the academy, that was even more dangerous. The tension from the first day had not faded. If anything, it had grown. Ethan could feel the stares following him wherever he went, some filled with curiosity, others with fear. He was used to it. Humans were still rare in the wider galaxy, and a Deathworlder in an academic setting was unheard of. As he entered the Academy's central plaza, he noticed how students parted before him, as if he carried an invisible force field. Some whispered as he passed. Others just stared, waiting, expecting something to happen. He sighed inwardly. If they were waiting for him to attack someone, they would be disappointed. The morning's first class was advanced xenobiology, a subject that Ethan actually found interesting. He slid into his seat at the back of the lecture hall, setting up his tablet. The moment he did, a student a few seats away moved, shifting several spots down, as if mere proximity to him was dangerous. Ethan ignored it. The instructor, Professor Vale, a soft-spoken Ilthian with delicate, translucent skin, began the lesson. A hologram flickered to life at the front of the room, showing various planetary classifications. Life develops in a vast range of conditions, Professor Vale explained, from gentle ocean worlds to extreme gas giants. But some planets, classified as death worlds, possess conditions so hostile that very few species can survive there, let alone evolve intelligence. The hologram shifted, displaying a terrifying image of Earth, the chaotic blue and green sphere. The way it was presented, it looked more like a battlefield than a home. Deathworlders are biologically unique, Vell continued. Their bodies are designed for extreme environments, high gravity, dangerous predators, volatile weather patterns. These factors result in an unusual combination of resilience, aggression, and rapid adaptability. Ethan felt the room's attention lock onto him. He knew what was coming. Vale turned toward him, her expression neutral. "Ethan Carter, you are from Earth. Would you care to share some insights into your homeworld?" He hesitated, not because he was nervous. He had just grown tired of this conversation. But he had to choose his words carefully. He was already under scrutiny. "Well," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, "Earth isn't as bad as people think. Sure, we have storms, predators, diseases, but we've adapted. We built cities, technology, medicine. We don't just survive there. We thrive." A student raised a hand. A pale, amphibious being from the Delvar species. "Is it true that creatures on your planet attack each other for dominance?" Ethan blinked. You mean like animals?" "No, I mean your species." A few others nodded, murmuring in agreement. They had heard the stories. Humans fought wars, competed for resources, engaged in violent sports. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had two choices: play into their fears or make them rethink their assumptions. "Humans don't fight because we're aggressive," he said. "We fight because we care about things. Our homes, our families, our beliefs. Yeah, we've had wars, but we also have peace. We explore, we create, we protect. That's what being human is." The room was silent. Some looked skeptical. Others seemed intrigued. Then, a deep, rumbling voice spoke from the side. "Sounds like an excuse." Ethan turned his head. Gorvak. The massive Brule warrior sat with his arms crossed, his yellow eyes gleaming with challenge. "You can dress it up however you want, Deathworlder," Gorvak said. "But I see it for what it is. Your kind is dangerous." Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. And yours isn't. A few gasps echoed through the room. Gorvak's lips curled into something between a grin and a snarl. Professor Vale cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "That's enough," she said. "We are here to learn, not to argue." Ethan turned back toward the front, but he could still feel Gorvak's eyes on him. This wasn't over. As the lecture continued, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Someone, maybe many someones, were waiting for him to prove the galaxy's fears right. And he wasn't sure if he could stop them. "You said." Ethan knew the moment he stepped into the cafeteria that something was off. The usual quiet murmurs of students eating and chatting halted the instant he crossed the threshold. Conversations cut short. Heads turned. A few even stood up and moved to different tables. He exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. This wasn't new. Ever since he arrived, students had either avoided him or treated him like a ticking time bomb. But today, the atmosphere felt different. He grabbed a meal tray and moved toward the food dispensers, trying to ignore the stares. The Academy's nutritional system wasn't exactly designed for humans, but he'd learned to make do. Selecting something that looked vaguely edible, he turned and scanned the room. Most tables were full, or at least the students at them pretended they were. Except for one. Gorvak sat alone, tearing into a chunk of meat, his yellow eyes locking onto Ethan the moment their gazes met. The massive Brule warrior smirked, as if daring Ethan to approach. Ethan wasn't in the mood for whatever game the alien was playing. Instead, he spotted an empty table in a corner and made his way toward it. Before he could sit down, a tall insectoid Karani student stepped into his path. Ethan stopped short, looking up into the creature's many dark, reflective eyes. "Human," the Karani hissed, its mandibles clicking. "You sit alone, yes." Ethan's grip tightened on his tray. Something in the alien's tone felt off. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Problem?" More movement. He saw two other students, a Delvar and a slender, fox-like Lothari, rising from their seats nearby, slowly circling him. "Ah, so that's what this is." "No problem," the Karani said. "Just curiosity." Ethan was very familiar with this type of curiosity. He had seen it in bullies back home, in gangs looking to test someone's limits. It wasn't about getting to know him. It was about seeing if he would break. And worse, the whole cafeteria was watching. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting, expecting. The Karani tilted its head. "You are strong, yes, Deathwhirler." Ethan set his tray down on the table beside him. Slowly, deliberately. "I get by." The Delavar student let out a low trill. "Then you won't mind. A little test." Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't need to ask what they meant. It was clear enough. A challenge. A fight. Something to prove that he wasn't like them. That he was the monster they had all been waiting for. Gorvak let out a low chuckle from his table. The big Brule warrior was watching, amused. Ethan hated this. If he fought, he would confirm their worst fears. If he backed down, they would see him as weak. No way out. The Karani took a step closer, its clawed fingers clicking together. "Well?" Ethan exhaled through his nose. He didn't want this. But if they pushed him... A sudden bang cut through the tension. Everyone turned. Professor Vale stood at the entrance, arms crossed, her delicate features sharp with disapproval. Silence fell over the cafeteria. The Karani hesitated, then stepped back. The other two students followed. Ethan held their gaze for a second longer, then picked up his tray. Without another word, he walked to his empty table and sat down. The moment passed. Conversations resumed. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "You said." Ethan had spent most of his life controlling his temper. On Earth, it was just part of being human. Out here, in a galaxy that feared him for what he could do, it was a necessity. But after the cafeteria incident, things only got worse. The stares became bolder. The whispers grew louder. Students didn't just avoid him now. They tested him. Small, subtle things at first. A foot stuck out in his path. A drink accidentally spilled on his table. Someone bumped into him in the halls a little too hard. And every time, he let it go, because that was the smart thing to do. Then someone decided to push further. It happened after class. Ethan was heading toward the dormitories when he heard footsteps behind him. More than one said. He wasn't surprised. After days of tension, it was only a matter of time before someone tried to corner him. He sighed and turned into an empty corridor. No point in dragging this into a crowded area. The moment he did, they moved in. 3 of them. The same students from the cafeteria. Karani, Delvar, Luthery. But now, there was a 4th. Gorvak. Ethan's muscles tensed. Of all the people in the academy, the big brule was the one he didn't want to deal with. The Karani student stepped forward, clicking its mandibles. "We've been watching you, Deathworlder." Ethan kept his expression blank. "Yeah? Enjoy the show." The Delvar let out a trill. "We just want to see what makes you special. Everyone says Deathworlders are dangerous. But you..." He tilted his head mockingly. "You don't seem so impressive." Ethan felt something sharp twist in his chest. He knew this game. It was the same one bullies played in every part of the universe. But this wasn't just about making him look weak. This was about making him break. And Gorvak, he was watching closely. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Look, I get it. You want to test me. Fine. But I'm not giving you what you want." The Karani's mandibles clicked in amusement. "And what do we want?" Ethan's eyes hardened. An excuse. A slow silence stretched between them. Then, without warning, the Luthery moved. Fast. Too fast for an untrained eye to follow. But Ethan had seen it coming. The alien's claws lashed out toward his shoulder. Just a light scratch, a provocation. Not enough to injure, just enough to push. Ethan's body reacted before his mind did. His hand snapped up, caught the Luthery's wrist mid-strike. A crack echoed in the hall. Not broken, but close. The Luthery let out a sharp yelp, eyes wide with shock. Ethan let go immediately. Stepped back. Hands open. Controlled. But it was too late. The Delvar hissed. "Did you see that?" He attacked first. Ethan's pulse spiked. No, that was a lie. And they all knew it. But it didn't matter. Because Gorvak was grinning. "You do have a temper after all," the brule rumbled. Ethan clenched his fists. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the trap closing around him. They wanted a fight. A real one. And if he threw a single punch, they would get exactly what they wanted. His heart pounded. "Walk away. Walk away." Gorvak took a step forward, looming. "What's wrong, Deathworlder?" Afraid. Ethan forced himself to breathe, forced his voice to stay calm. No. His eyes met the brule's. Unflinching. Unmoved. "I just don't waste my time on idiots." A flicker of something passed through Gorvak's gaze. Not anger, not amusement. Something else. Then, after a long pause, the brule let out a low, rumbling chuckle. Interesting. He turned and walked away. The others hesitated, then followed. Ethan stayed still, watching them go. His hands were still shaking. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ethan sat on the edge of his dorm bed, staring at his hands. His fingers were still trembling. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, from restraint. He had spent years learning to control himself, holding back when someone shoved him, smiling when someone insulted him, keeping his voice even when someone called him Deathworlder like it was a curse. But today had been close. Too close. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not here. Not when every single student in this academy was waiting for him to snap. A sudden chime broke through his thoughts. A message. Ethan blinked and checked his holopad. The center's name made him pause. Professor Vale. His shoulders tensed as he read the message. Report to my office. Immediately, Ethan stood outside Professor Vale's door, his jaw tight. He had expected this. Of course he had. The academy staff had been watching him, just like the students, waiting for the moment he became a problem. Maybe today had finally given them the excuse they needed. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. Professor Vale sat behind her desk, her sharp violet eyes studying him as the door slid shut. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unreadable. Ethan kept his posture straight, unapologetic. If this is about the fight, he said, voice steady, I didn't start it. Vale tilted her head. No, you didn't. That surprised him. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me, Ethan, do you know why you were admitted to this academy? He hesitated. Because I passed the entrance exams. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. You did more than pass. You ranked in the top 5%, academically and physically. Ethan frowned. Then what's the problem? Vale studied him for a long moment. The problem is that you are a death worlder in a school that has never had one before. Ethan clenched his fists. Of course. The same excuse. The same argument. They don't want me here, he muttered. That's not entirely true. Vale leaned back. Some want you gone. Others want to see what you can do. Her gaze sharpened. And a few want to see if they can break you. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't have to. She already knew. Her fingers tapped against the desk. I saw what happened today. You held back. Ethan exhaled. What else was I supposed to do? Vale watched him carefully. Then, after a moment, she said, nothing. He blinked. What? You did nothing. Her voice was even. You controlled yourself. You walked away. That was the right decision. Ethan stared at her. So, you're not punishing me. Val's lips curved slightly. For what? Defending herself, showing restraint. She shook her head. No, I brought you here to warn you. His stomach twisted. Warn me about what? Val's eyes darkened. You think today was a test. She leaned forward. You haven't seen anything yet. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. Val continued. Gorvac isn't done with you, and neither are the others. She folded her hands. The more you refuse to react, the more they will push. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then what am I supposed to do? Vale studied him. That's up to you. Silence hung between them. Then, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a small data chip, sliding it across the desk. What's this? Ethan asked. Val's expression was unreadable. A lesson. He picked up the chip, weighing it in his palm. He could tell this wasn't just a warning. It was a choice, and something told him, whatever came next was going to change everything. Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the small data chip in his hand. It felt heavy, despite its size. A lesson, Vale had called it. He had debated ignoring it, tossing it in a drawer and forgetting it existed. But something about the way Vale had spoken, the way her violet eyes had watched him. She knew something, and if Ethan had learned anything in his time here, it was that knowledge meant survival. With a quiet sigh, he slotted the chip into his holopad. The screen flickered. A file appeared. No title, just a timestamp. Ethan hesitated, then tapped it open. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A training hall. Combat drills. Ethan frowned. Was this some kind of academy archive? Then the camera shifted, and he saw himself. No, not him. Someone else. Another human. Ethan's breath caught. He leaned forward, eyes locked onto the screen. The figure moved with a fluid grace, their stance unmistakably human. They weren't just sparring. They were winning. Their alien opponent, a heavily armored Exhilarating, swung a massive training blade, only to be outmaneuvered in an instant. A dodge, a counterstrike, a clean, efficient takedown. Ethan's pulse pounded. This wasn't just a recording. This was proof. He wasn't the first. Someone else had been here before him. Another Deathworlder. But why had no one ever mentioned them? The footage continued, showing more matches, more victories. Ethan watched, fascinated, inspired. The way the human moved, the way they controlled every fight. It was like watching a blueprint, a roadmap to survival. Then, the last file began, and everything changed. This time, the footage wasn't from a training hall. It was from a security feed. A dark corridor. The same human stood in the center, surrounded. Ethan's stomach twisted. 4 figures closed in. Ethan recognized the body language instantly. Predators circling prey. The same way Gorvac had tested him. But this human, they didn't back down. The lead alien said something. Muffled, distorted. A taunt. A threat. The human didn't flinch. Then, the first attack came. Fast, a blur of movement. Ethan barely caught it. But the human, they saw it coming. A sharp sidestep. A counterstrike. The alien collapsed. The second attacker lunged, only to be met with a brutal elbow strike. The third hesitated. Too late. In seconds, it was over. Ethan's heart was racing. Who was this? But before he could process it, the screen flickered. New footage. The same corridor. Hours later. This time, the human lay motionless. Ethan's breath stilled. A shadow moved into the frame. A figure, not a student, not a rival, an instructor. They knelt beside the unconscious human, checked their pulse, then tapped their wrist comm. A voice crackled through the speaker. It's done. The problem is removed. Ethan's blood turned to ice. The footage ended. For a long time, he didn't move. His hands clenched around the holopad. His mind raced. This wasn't just about bullying. This wasn't about Gorvac or some arrogant students testing him. This academy had a pattern, a history, and if Ethan wasn't careful, he would be next. Ethan sat in silence, his pulse hammering in his ears. He stared at the black screen of his holopad. The last words of the recording burned into his mind. It's done. The problem is removed. That human, the one who came before him, wasn't just a student. They had been a target. And now, Ethan knew the truth. This academy didn't just test Deathworlders. It erased them. A cold weight settled in his chest. They were going to come for him. The next morning, Ethan moved differently. He walked through the halls like a man seeing everything for the first time. The way the instructors glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking. The way certain students, not just Gorvac and his lackeys, studied him as if measuring something. It wasn't just hostility. It was calculation. Some of them wanted him gone. Others wanted to see how much he could take before he broke. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. He had to be smart. If they thought he suspected something, they'd move faster. He needed to buy time. For what, he wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing. He was not going to end up like the last human. Training Hall 4 was empty when Ethan arrived. He had made sure of that. He ran the footage again, pausing every few seconds, studying every move the past Deathworlder had made. They had been faster than him, smoother, more refined. Ethan knew he was strong. Humans were built for endurance, for survival, but raw power wouldn't be enough. Not against whatever was coming. He mimicked their movements, slow at first, then faster, again, again, again. His body adjusted, his reflexes sharpened. Hours passed, sweat dripped from his brow, but he kept going. Then, the door opened. Ethan's instincts screamed, danger. He turned, muscles tensed, but it wasn't an enemy. It was Vale. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. Vale sighed. I had a feeling you would. She stepped forward, her sharp violet eyes scanning him. And now you know. Ethan clenched his jaw. That this place is a trap. Vale tilted her head slightly. Not a trap. A test. He let out a bitter laugh. Some test. The last human failed, didn't they? Vale didn't answer right away. But when she did, her voice was careful. They underestimated what they were up against. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And me. Am I supposed to fail too? Vale studied him for a long moment. Then, to his shock, she shook her head. No, she said. I want you to win. Silence hung between them. Ethan frowned. Why? Vale stepped closer, lowering her voice. Because the last Deathworlder wasn't supposed to be here. You are. He froze. Her gaze darkened. They let you in, Ethan, but not to see you succeed. She took another step forward. They want to know how much it takes to break you. Ethan's blood ran cold. Who? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Val's lips pressed into a thin line. The ones who run this academy. Ethan exhaled sharply. So that was it. This wasn't just about the students, the instructors, the entire system. They were watching him. Waiting. Measuring. Planning. A test. A game. A sick experiment. Ethan clenched his fists. Let them watch. Let them wait. Because he had already made his decision. He wasn't going to break. He was going to win. Ethan sat in his dorm room, staring at his reflection in the small mirror above his desk. His face was bruised, a dark mark trailing along his jaw where Gorvac had struck him in their last encounter. But the pain didn't matter. Not anymore. He knew the truth now. This academy had never been about training the best warriors. It had never been about education, about discipline, about honor. It had been about control. And the moment they had allowed a Deathworlder inside, it had become something even worse, an experiment. Ethan had seen the signs from the beginning, the careful manipulations, the way they had pushed him, tested his limits, observed his reactions. They weren't just trying to see if he could survive. They wanted to know how far they could push him before he snapped. But they had made a mistake. He wasn't going to break. He was going to end this. The first step was silence. Ethan kept his head down, followed orders, played along. He let them believe he was still in the dark, still just another Deathworlder struggling to prove himself. He trained harder, studied more. Let them think he was simply trying to keep up. But in the background, he was planning, watching. He memorized the guard rotations, the blind spots in the security systems. He took note of which instructors seemed truly loyal to the academy, and which ones hesitated when no one was watching. And most importantly, he watched Vale. She was still an enigma. But one thing was clear, she wasn't like the others. She wasn't just another pawn in their game. She had warned him. And that meant, for now, he had one potential ally. The night before the final combat trials, Ethan slipped out of his dorm. He moved quickly, sticking to the corridors he knew weren't heavily patrolled. Vale was waiting in the shadows near the training hall. "You're late," she murmured. Ethan shrugged. "Had to make sure no one followed me." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're really going through with this? Do I have a choice?" Vale exhaled. "No, not if you want to leave this place alive." She handed him a small device, a data chip. "This has everything," she said. "Records of what happened to the last Deathworlder. Evidence of the Academy's real purpose. If you can get this to the right people, you might be able to expose them." Ethan took the chip, his fingers closing around it tightly. This was it, the key to everything. But Vale wasn't finished. "They won't let you walk away, Ethan. You know that, right?" He smirked. "I wasn't planning on walking." Vale arched an eyebrow. "Then what's your plan?" Ethan's expression hardened. "I'm going to make them regret ever bringing a Deathworlder here." The final combat trial was held in the central arena, a massive coliseum where the entire academy could watch. The instructors sat in high observation booths, evaluating each fight, making their calculations. Ethan stepped into the arena. His opponent stood across from him. Gorvak. The instructor's voice echoed over the comms. This will be a test of endurance. The match will continue until one fighter is no longer able to stand. Ethan felt a cold, dark amusement settle in his chest. Perfect. The signal was given. Gorvak lunged. Ethan didn't dodge. He caught the alien's arm and twisted, using the brute's own momentum against him. The crowd gasped as Gorvak slammed into the ground with a thud. The alien roared and charged again. Ethan sidestepped, driving an elbow into his ribs, followed by a vicious knee to the gut. Gorvak staggered, but Ethan didn't stop. He didn't let him breathe. A punch, a strike to the throat, a sharp twist of the wrist, and suddenly Gorvak was on his knees. The crowd fell silent. The instructors were watching closely now. Ethan turned his gaze upward, locking eyes with them through the observation booth's glass. And then he spoke. "I know what you've done." The murmurs in the crowd stopped. The air grew thick. Ethan pressed a boot against Gorvak's back, forcing the alien down onto the ground. But he didn't finish him. "I'm not here to play your game," he said. "I'm here to end it." Up in the observation booth, the instructors stiffened. One of them signaled the guards. Ethan had expected that. He reached into his sleeve, pressing the hidden trigger Vale had given him. The data chip activated, broadcasting everything. The arena's massive holoscreens flickered to life, and in front of the entire academy, the truth played out. The secret footage, the past Deathworlder, the murder, the academy's dark secret, exposed. Chaos erupted. Students shouted. Instructors scrambled. Ethan stepped back from Gorvak and smiled. Checkmate. The days that followed were a blur. Investigations, arrests. The academy's leadership dismantled. Ethan was given a choice: return to Earth or stay and help rebuild. He chose neither, because Ethan had learned something in this place, something important. The galaxy was watching, and if Deathworlders like him were feared, he was going to give them a reason to be. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning.